Hello everyone, welcome along to the Event Industry News Podcast. My name is James Dickson, wishing you a very good morning, afternoon or evening, whenever or wherever you are tuning into today's podcast from. The podcast is brought to you by our sponsor, Engage, powered by D2I Systems, winner of Best Event Management Platform at the 2017 Event Technology Awards. To learn how Engage can make your business more profitable, visit d2isystems.com/engage. Welcome along, everybody, to today's podcast, and welcome along to our guest today. Please give a warm welcome to the podcast to Jim Bowes. Jim is the founder and CEO of Manifesto. Jim, great to have you on board today.
Good to be here.
Before we sort of delve into the podcast, we're going to be looking a little bit at contactless and a contactless society and referencing a specific example. But let's talk about Manifesto first of all, Jim. How and why was that created?
Yeah, so Manifesto is a digital agency. We work extensively in the not-for-profit sector. So we work with clients like the National Trust, like UNICEF UK, sort of reimagining their websites and reimagining their world for sort of, the digital revolution that's occurred over the last few years, and also looking to the future, to this sort of world of automation that's coming, and obviously systems like contactless relevant in that. I've had an extensive career in digital, but I've also had a varied career. I'm sure we'll talk about my stand-up comedy past in a little while. And really, Manifesto is a business that really helps to work with organisations to create positive change through using sort of digital technology.
Sure. So we've got a digital agency, and as you alluded to briefly there, Jim is I say a former stand-up comedian. I guess nobody is really a former stand-up comedian. You're always a stand-up comedian. It might just not be your main source of income at the moment.
Yeah, I'm a stand-up comedian on hiatus, and I thought really seriously about whether to take a show to Edinburgh this year, and we just, the agency's going through a great growth period, and really when I started the agency I just took that decision to take a break. So 2010 was my last show, but it's always there in the back of my mind, just saying, maybe it's time to do another show. And I think what I'd certainly do next time around is perhaps bring together my two loves and bring sort of technology into the comedy show, and so that's the thing that's burning away in the back of my mind. I do a podcast called Alexa Stop, which is about how technology is changing our lives, and that's my real fascination, is how do things like me going away, how do things like robots coming into our homes, what's the impact on all of us that going to be?
Well, two things to pick up from there, Jim. First of all, I was on a phone call this morning with somebody who was actually having to hold the phone call for a couple of seconds and shout, "Alexa, stop." Right. Because she was decided to chirp in the background while the conversation was taking place. And secondly, again, you alluded to a show at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and whether or not you're going to do that, which does bring us nicely onto today's subject and why we're talking to you today. Because back in July, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival announced that it was introducing contactless donations for street performers for the first time. And it followed the news that London will become the first city to roll out contactless payments for buskers, so that passers-by no longer have to fiddle around in their pockets and sort of fish for that awkward change that they may have kicking about at the bottom of their handbag or right down in the deepest, darkest depths of their pockets. This is fascinating because, as anybody who knows the Edinburgh Festival and who's ever been to it, there are literally thousands and thousands of shows there. I think last year the statistic was that there were just over 50,000 shows performed during the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and that's not counting the street performers and the buskers and the people who are actually out there on the streets performing. And people want to show their appreciation. So when we look at how far we've come with contactless payments and contactless donations, cashless societies, what does this represent on a journey, if you will, from going from utilising cash, Jim, to actually having cashless and contactless as a very, very much an integral part of our day-to-day activities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a fascinating behaviour change, because I think for a long time we talked about this coming, and we were like, well, in X number of years, when none of us are going to be using cash. And actually, for a long time, it just didn't happen. And then I think now we're really seeing the effect of a sort of generational change where, you know, I was at a market in Victoria Park, a food market on Sunday, and it's completely cashless. So there's maybe 20 food pop-up stores there, and the market has mandated that cash can't be accepted. So they've decided that, you know, the way that everyone should pay for everything is with a card. And what I'm seeing now is, you know, there's been that period of time where you had to, if you were going to a festival, you were like, oh my God, I'm going to have to make sure I've got cash. That's completely flipped. And now if you've got cash, you're going to be wondering if you can spend it. And that's just a really fascinating change. And I think that's to do with, there's a generation that's come through that don't expect to carry cash. I still sort of sit somewhere in between. I love using contactless. I think it's a really efficient method. I know people have some security concerns around it, you know, because obviously it's so easy. But I also still feel reassured by having some cash in my wallet. So I guess I sort of show my age by being part of that sort of in-between generation of people that, you know, grew up with an analog childhood and a digital adulthood, where I sort of show some traits from either side of that divide.
Yeah, I would definitely go along with that in exactly the same way. You know, I've become very, very comfortable using things like Apple Pay, using contactless card payments. I have no issues with that. And my own personal attitude, and some may call me naive, is that the easier that these solutions are made for us to make contactless payments, then the tighter the security tends to become with the companies who are processing those payments. So for every step forward to make it easier, there's also a step made in the security and the encryption and everything that goes on behind the scenes to make sure that we are secure. And if you are compromised in any way, there will also be procedures in place to make sure that you are remunerated accordingly. So I tend to be one of these people that's quite relaxed about how it all works. I mean, that said, I suppose the more curious question to me when it comes to something like Edinburgh and contactless payments for street performers is how will they get their money? That's the first thing that springs to my mind. Have you got any inkling, or have you had any insights to how their system is actually going to be set up to work?
I don't know how that one's set up specifically, but I think, you know, there are lots of models out there for how things could work. I mean, I think, you know, actually the first version of the internet gave us PayPal, and PayPal makes it very easy for people to sort of send payments using basically an email address. And I think really lots of these systems will just be based on registration onto a platform that links a performance slot to a person. Because actually one of the things we can say about Edinburgh is even the street performance slots on the official stages are very tightly run and very well run.
Yes.
And so it's the same people on the same stage at the same time every day, actually, normally for at least a week. And so I think, and I remember when in 2007, I stayed on the Royal Mile when I was performing at Edinburgh, and I got woken up by a chorus line singing Fat Bottom Girls every morning. And that was my sort of wake up to the day, was this exactly the same noise, same song, 27 days in a row, which is Groundhog Day sort of coming real, really.
Yeah. They had Sonny and Cher in Groundhog Day, and you had Fat Bottom Girls.
Yeah, exactly. From a chorus line of, you know, teenagers who are doing a show, you know, around the corner, and very good they were too. But I mean, I'm sure the 27th time they'd sung that chorus line at 11 a.m. every morning, they were a little bit bored of it. So,
well, when we going back to this idea of contactless payments for buskers, we have dealt with the idea of cashless payments at events and festivals and things like that on the podcast a number of times over the last few years, and how it's slowly but surely getting its way and getting established within the UK event space. The fact that it's now going down to street performer level, is there any excuse now for event organisers, for businesses, for companies to have any sort of reluctance to take on contactless payments?
I mean, I think absolutely not. I mean, I know some of the mainstream retailers resisted for a little while, but they saw that wave of consumer demand for this. And I mean, I remember going to festivals in the mid-90s, and the bars were cashless, and you had to do this terrible thing where you had to queue up with your cash and buy tickets. And then you had to use the cashless tickets at the bar. So you had to do 2 queues just to get yourself a lemonade, which was one of the most horrific experiences possible. And so organisers of these events that come together very quickly are obviously concerned about cash as a medium, and contactless has made, paying quickly using a card as quick as cash. So lots of those concerns around, fraud and people stealing money, they all get taken away by this system. And so whilst there are some concerns around some elements of security or people taking other people's cards, it's actually much, much better than lots of people in a field or lots of people at a major event carrying huge amounts of cash, which is clearly a much bigger risk.
Moving that whole sort of discussion on to something that you mentioned at the start that relates to Manifesto as an agency. You mentioned that you're working with a lot of organizations, a lot maybe major charities and people who themselves are not-for-profit organizations who are perhaps relying on donations and income from people in order to maintain their own operations. Have you seen evidence where charitable organizations have sort of been able to embrace in a similar way the contactless side of things in order to fulfill their own fundraising?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's several examples of contactless donation boxes that people have in shops. There's some new kiosks that are being incorporated into shops. So it's not just the contactless payment, but it's also incorporating sort of broader digital experiences either into charity shops or into events. So we know a number of charities do on-spot registration. So events like Race for Life, as an event where people run 5 or 10 kilometres, there's a really good moment of opportunity at that event to get people to sign up again for the following year. And the ability to execute on that and take a payment instantly makes a huge difference to the conversion rate. So why not take advantage of that moment when someone feels incredibly positive towards this amazing thing that they've just done? There's also sort of slightly more unusual examples. There's a bench near Old Street that's like a sort of contactless charity bench that I think it gives out Wi-Fi and allows some kind of donation or something. So that's sort of really in the innovation space. I've also seen a couple of apps that, I mean, I don't know how you feel about QR codes, but I feel like they've been an innovation that isn't really that much of an innovation that's been hanging around this space for a long time.
I feel that QR codes are the equivalent of the mini disc.
Yeah, they kind of have their place, right? So most phones can recognize them pretty quickly and pretty easily, and they're very good at linking people to a quick payment system. So they're like a sort of, they're a piece of sort of useful technology that sits below the contactless payment. And I've seen quite a few examples of people basically trying to use QR codes because the technology is incredibly simple. And, so if you're someone that, like the National Trust, who has a massive garden, it's very, very cheap to stick a QR code out next to a wishing well miles away from any property or any electricity, whereas to run something contactless, you might need slightly more capability in that location.
Indeed. So there is a place for it, and I suppose that draws me in some respects to the next thing I was going to ask you, which is the considerations that need to be made before introducing it, because I still think that there's an argument, certainly in the events industry, that just because people are singing the praises about RFID, contactless payments, cashless bars, whatever they may be, that things still need to be looked at very, very objectively and subjectively on a case-by-case basis. So you have to look at your audience, you have to look at a number of different things. So when you've looked at this before and looked at this as a subject, if someone came to you and said, well, what are the considerations that need to be made before maybe deploying contactless, what sort of list would you draw up?
Yeah, and I think you'd look at the circumstance, you'd look at the sort of numbers of people that are likely to be involved in the transactions. You'd want to look at what the average transaction value is likely to be, because very clearly there are some limits with contactless. So if you want to run a silent auction for a charity event for high value items, standard sort of contactless methods of payment are not going to be particularly effective. So it's really about sort of taking in holistically the environment. And then on the flip side, it's also, and this is what people often sort of don't think about so much, is what's the capability of your organization to process and deal with these payments coming in a different way. So most organizations of any scale will have some kind of CRM system. They'll have a finance department that needs to reconcile things. They'll need to allocate the payments to appropriate pots so it gets spent in the right way. And as soon as you get to, and I'm speaking kind of specifically now about the not-for-profit sector, but it can get quite complicated. And so some of what needs to happen as well is, have we got the desire to go through the change that's required in our organisation to deal with this? And I've worked on several projects just to introduce the ability to accept PayPal into major charities, which most of these are sort of 5 odd years ago now. But that was a really big deal, because what had happened historically was there'd been a procurement process, someone had selected this is our partner for payments. The finance system had been updated to accept the payments from this provider, and they always sent through a code that helped them allocate it. And any change to that process was a big people change. So consider the market, consider the opportunity, and consider the people, and consider the internal change would be my take on that.
Sure, and there are still people that I guess are frightened by it. But one thing that I suppose the bigger question that senior management may be asking is will it bring in more revenue? Because I guess when you make something easier, you would hopefully also look to be increasing how much of those payments you're actually taking. Is there an argument where people are spending more because payment systems are becoming easier?
Yeah, I think, there's a few things there. So when I originally worked on those PayPal projects, to sort of bring it back to that, there was evidence to suggest that people who had money sitting in a PayPal account or another payment account don't consider that the same as money in their bank account. So they're more happy to do something more freely with money so let's say they sold their bike and they've got 100 quid sitting in their PayPal account. They don't really see that as real money. They sort of see it as free money. The research showed. So then they're happy to spend it in a different way. What you also see is, I think, that there's a behaviour change that's generational. So particularly for charities, obviously we do a lot of work with them, but this applies more broadly. People are less comfortable with making longer term commitments, particularly to donations to charities. Yeah. So people experience things on social media or in person, and they have an emotional response to that or an excited response to that, and they're more likely to do something in the moment that is a bigger spend amount or a bigger donation amount, as opposed to just saying, I love this cause or I love this provider and I'm going to commit to X per month. That's a behaviour that's shrinking. And
without wanting to sort of get too deep on it, is there an ethical question that we need to ask over the ease of payments? Because there have been sort of various figures, in the last few years where people talk about the younger generation perhaps ending up with more debt than any generation has ever had in this country before. Is there at any point, is there an ethical question to ask about the ease of these payments and the impact it has on people's personal finances?
Yeah, I think there's always ethical questions when it comes to money. And I think, we as humans have our automatic system and our reflective system. And if we're spending money that we can't afford with our automatic system, our impulsive system, and then we go home later and when we reflect, we really wish we hadn't, that's not a cool thing. I think, okay, so that means that as marketeers or as event organizers, we've a responsibility to not overly hard sell things. And I think as an industry, the finance industry has a responsibility to its customers to help them manage their own risk. And that should be about giving people the tools necessary to perhaps limit their behavior, and perhaps where things go too far, perhaps not being overly generous with giving credit and things like that in situations where it's not appropriate. And I think we know that there was a pattern, pre-financial crisis, I suppose, where overly giving credit to people that couldn't really afford to pay it back caused major problems later on. I think my sense is, and I have nothing to back this up, that overall we're a slightly more cautious society on the other side, that gradually now 11 years later, we're just getting a bit more relaxed again. And so it's a good time to ask that question of ourselves as marketeers, as people that work in the finance industry. What is our ethical responsibility? And I think actually ethics as a topic, jumping outside of finance and contactless for a moment, is going to be one of the biggest discussion points generally as we automate work and the workplace with bots and things like that. The question of ethics and when and how we introduce technology into our lives is going to be something that pushes up the agenda.
And I suppose when you think about it from a chronological point of view, if you can call it that with the financial crisis, occurring in 2008, that's a decade ago. So, children who were 7, 8, 9, 10 years old when that happened, who were perhaps not overly aware of it at the time, have now grown up. They're now becoming 18, 19, 20 years old, young adults. They're starting jobs, they have bank accounts, that they will perhaps be slightly unaware of this. So we've almost got a generation who are starting to become aware of money, and you almost have to re-educate everybody again, haven't you? Where we could end up in that cycle again of people being unaware of just how easy it is to get into debt.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, the thing that I think makes the key difference with that point is, have you been of working age and working through a period where the economy has really struggled, and did it have a personal impact on you?
Sure.
And I think those are so if you've not experienced that, then, I'd say I've got a reasonably high appetite for risk, but I've noticed it start to sort of just ease back a little bit as I've gone through my career, and I'm not quite as outlandish in my decisions as I once was. And I think that probably those things that have happened along the way shape your outlook. Yeah,
definitely. Just on a more light-hearted note, I was one of the first things that struck me when I read about the Edinburgh Fringe Festival allowing contactless payments to be made is, without wanting to pigeonhole the Edinburgh Festival audience goers, they may well partake of the occasional beverage when they're in Edinburgh, and whether or not there's any sort of limit that's going to be put onto individual cards that would prohibit somebody from rolling out of a pub at 9:30 in the evening, 3 sheets to the wind, and just going around and tapping their card willy-nilly on every street performer they see. I wonder if there is anything in place to maybe just, stop people overspending and waking up the next day going, crikey, how much I spent.
They had a couple of pints and they suddenly think they're the world's biggest philanthropist, and they want to help every comedian and performer in Edinburgh.
This guy's going to be the next Ed Sheeran. I'm going to help him out. Have 30 quid, mate. Then the next guy, and then the next guy, and then the next guy, and then the next guy. And before they know it, they're 250 quid down.
Yeah, so how many do you think is the right number for the bank to step in and stop it? By the time 3 times in 3 minutes, is that too many?
Yeah, well, there's the question, and I don't know. And one would presume that these systems now, with the amount of customization that you can do with them on a serious note, you could probably build something that to that effect into it.
Yeah, I think the fraud detection, machine learning around fraud detection, something that it's very good at. It is strong, and so I think that's just about the banks being savvy to it, and I'm sure the systems do already step in using value and time as a key vector for what they look at.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to find out. So, this is very much a step, as we noted in our pre-podcast notes on the digitization journey, if you can call it that. And as a company that's working very much in that world, are you ever able to sort of take a step back and see where this is taking us to on a journey, or are we very much still venturing into the unknown?
So I spoke at South by Southwest this year about the future, I suppose. Is really, and I'm an optimist, right? And so I was taking. So my take is the best is yet to come.
Yeah.
And the premise of the talk was that the automation of a number of jobs and things in our lives will cause a second renaissance. That was the premise of my talk, because we'll all have more time for music and philosophy and art, and the bots can do the hard work. And it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but overall, I think one of the great things about automating mundane work is that it gives us a lot more time to sort of live in the human experience. And there's still going to be plenty of work for us to do. McKinsey did a big report saying about 46% of UK work can be automated. But of that, most people's jobs fall into, they do a few things that are fairly easy to automate, and they do plenty of things that are not. It's not really like that 10 people over there, they're going to be automated. It's more like these 3 tasks you do, these 2 tasks you do, probably in 10 years time, you're not going to need to do them. And so, communication, creativity, conversations, that sort of more emotional side of what it is to work in teams and to collaborate, and all those things become the great things that the future's about. And interestingly, lots of stuff about events, because that's what the podcast is about, is all about those things that aren't too easy to automate. Because when something happens last minute with a sound system, or there's a supplier, or you run out of ice, or all those things are very human in their nature.
They are, yes. It's interesting, and again on the podcast we've spoken a lot about augmented reality, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and how things are moving and shaping, and artificial learning, where machines and things are learning. Just praying that we don't have Arnold Schwarzenegger knocking at our door at any point in the next sort of 10 years, because everything's gone to that extent. But fingers crossed, eh?
Well, I think if he does, what you'll find out is that the Arnold Schwarzenegger bot that's been produced can only do like 3 things. It'll be, like those keywords you used to get of Mr. T that had 6 sayings. Because actually at the moment, all AI is very narrow in its nature. So, it's the thing in the Uber app that tells you how long before your taxi arrives and what your fare is going to be. Well, that's 2 separate pieces of machine learning and AI. And they don't work together at the moment. And some things can work together, but you hear a phrase like deep learning, and if we break down what that is, Amazon have released a camera called an AWS Deep Lens in May, and that's a deep learning video camera for $250. But what that has got is image recognition, and it splits images down into separate parts to recognize their components, and so therefore, because it's multi-layered, it is deep learning. But what you can do with that is still, it's whilst incredibly impressive, I can recognize that a dog's a dog and a cat's a cat, or a hot dog's a hot dog. It's still a long way from being able to assess a situation and do any number of things that a human might do in that situation.
Just referencing that's where we stand in 2018, people. We have cameras that can recognize the difference between dogs and hot dogs.
Yeah, exactly. It's important, right?
It's vital. I'm sure everybody has been waiting for that one, and it will be added to people's Christmas lists post haste, without any doubt. We've been talking on the podcast today to Jim Bowes. Jim is the founder and CEO of Manifesto, a digital agency that supports a lot of organisations and not-for-profit organisations with the development of their own digital pathways and their own digital platforms. But we've been talking, I suppose, specifically about an announcement that the Edinburgh Fringe Festival made back in July, which said that it is introducing contactless donations for street performers for the first time. And what that presents as a wider discussion on the whole contactless and cashless payment society that we're rapidly becoming. Jim, thanks very much for joining the podcast today. It's been great to have you on.
Thank you. It's been great. Thank you for having me.
The podcast is brought to you by our sponsor, Engage, powered by D2I Systems, winner of Best Event Management Platform at the Event Technology Awards 2017. To learn how Engage can make your business more profitable, visit d2isystems.com/engage. Don't forget that if you hop onto eventindustrynews.com, there are various links to the Event Industry News app that you can download for your smartphone that will keep you up to date with all of the features, the latest content, and the latest podcasts that are going out via Event Industry News. And if you want to follow us on any of the usual social media platforms, all you've got to do is hop onto your preferred one and search for Event Industry News or at Event News Blog. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Thanks very much for joining us. Thanks very much again to Jim Bowes, our guest today, and we'll see you on the next episode. Very goodbye to you all.